Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm Philip Rosenthal from Christian View Network. And I think, first of all, before we start the detail of this discussion, I think we need to look at, firstly, why this is important to all parents in South Africa, and possibly is one of the most important bills that we have looked at over the last decade. It certainly changes the situation for a generation of parents and is the biggest change in education in the last 25 years. Now, I start off with the presupposition that all education assumes a worldview and consequently assumes belief. So consequently, all education is inherently religious. One cannot avoid that. But we have a diverse society, and we have different views from different parents about what type of education they would like for their children. We also have a difference between individual children, that their needs, their strengths and weaknesses and the way that they might want to be educated, or what might be best for them, may be different. And we believe that parents are the ones who can best determine that. Now, there are really two different visions for how we solve this problem of the inherent religious nature of education, and also the difference and the diversity in our society. The one solution, could I have the next slide, is that the state should decide. The other solution is that parents should decide for each child through the mechanisms that are devolved through the Constitution, through the Schools Act, and the options that are available to them in public schools, in private schools, and through home education. And then in each of those, through the different options that they have to express their views. Now, could I have the next slide? Sorry, next two slides. Duane? Okay. Okay, I can shift to my own. Have you got a problem there that it's not pairing? Okay, now I think we've got three pieces of guidance in terms of this question of should the state decide or should parents decide. The first piece of guidance is the Bible. Now, every single scripture in the Bible that deals with children gives an instruction to parents on how to look after their children, and it gives an instruction to children to listen to their parents. There is no instruction that gives a mandate to the state to control education. So any mandate that the state has is delegated from parents, and I believe it's really important for every official, every teacher to remember that that mandate comes from God to parents, to them. They don't have that mandate directly from the state. And at every point, everybody who becomes involved in helping children needs to remember their accountability to the parents of those children, unless there is a special situation where the parents are doing something neglectful or criminal. The second guidance that we have is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and this is the only right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights where it says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. That means that the United Nations emphasized that they did not grant this right. That right was there before the United Nations was founded and cannot be taken away. It's a prior right. So we just have to all respect that right that is God-given to parents. Then the Western Cape Constitution helpfully says that the government must adopt policy that allows children to receive basic education in a system of their parents' choice. The National Constitution talks about the best interests of the child being paramount, but if one interprets that through other documents, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one assumes that the parents are the ones who decide what is best for that child, and not a one-size-fits-all solution decided by some official in the state. Now, if I could have the next slide, I'd like you to think about the fact that you are all parents, and I'd like to you to think about the value that you place on your children and the best future that you want for them. Llewellyn, could I have the next one? And how unhappy you would be if somebody tried to do something to your children in education that you were not happy about. You would be very angry. And I think that that is the situation that we have now in this country. We don't have thousands of parents protesting in the streets, but what we do have, if I could have the next slide, is a protest through the internet where we have had more response on this particular bill than any other bill in the history of South Africa, apart from the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was dealing with 100 different issues, but this really shows that parents care about this issue more than they care about any other issue in South African history. That is why they made so many submissions and they have voiced their concerns so loudly on social media. We have, just for an example, when the Department of Basic Education introduced proposals for sex education in school, within 3 weeks, there was more than 100,000 parents had joined a social media group that was opposed to this particular proposal. So they were not happy with that. And I would ask parliamentarians, you're there to represent your constituents, and constituents have, across a diversity of different groups, really voiced a strong, unanimous statement that they want parents to be the ones who make this decision. Now, when we look at the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, as it was originally proposed, there have thankfully been a number of improvements, which I thank the Department of Education for. The first improvement was that teacher appointments are now with the school governing bodies. We want to keep it that way. Educators don't have to declare their finances, and they can, these governing bodies can verify the ability of parents to pay. Then there's been a relaxation of a number of the provisions that parents were unhappy with. The first one is the leasing of facilities has been relaxed to 1 year. Then the penalty has been relaxed from 6 years to 1 year. We're still not happy with that. We want 0 jail time for parents who may homeschool their parents. Then the home education requirement to make submissions is reduced from annual to each phase. There's a complex process on language policy, and the language has been slightly softened with regard to curriculum. The part which has not been fixed, and I would like to appeal to members of parliament, please, to help to fix these things, is the school governing bodies' control on admissions, which affects their financial viability, it affects their ethos, and affects their language, because they need to get a group of people who share a common vision. Not everybody has that same vision, and we can have different schools with different ethoses and methods. Then it also impacts the viability of schools to employ extra teachers to improve those schools. Now, the next provision I'd like to ask you to change, please, is the school governing bodies are at the moment all required to declare all their financial interests and those of their spouses and their children. Now, that is unreasonable, and a lot of parents are going to avoid being on the governing body because they don't want to do that. Just on the left there is an article. It had 6,000 shares, which equates to 1 million views. That was essentially the same submission I'm giving you now in 2017. And I think that really shows parents are interested in this issue. The next issue is that, and I think that in terms of parents being on the governing body, it's sufficient for them to just declare any business that they might have with the school. They shouldn't be doing business with the school if they're on the governing body. Don't have to declare everything. Then the homeschooling, if one removes the requirement for consultants to do assessments, that adds to costs, and people are already sacrificing one income in order to home educate. Then an increased flexibility on alternative curriculums. And then for independent schools, this requirement for subsidies to have quarterly financial statements is onerous and is going to distract them from teaching. I think annual reports are quite sufficient. Now, there's a diversity of reasons, if one can have the next slide, why parents are unhappy with their local school, and many of them are wanting to have a say on their governing bodies, and they are also opting for home education. Could I have the next slide, Lewin? That includes this sexual sin education, pornography, gangs, teen pregnancy, abortion referral, drugs, gender confusion, bullying, woke religion, interfaith religion, the removal of the Bible from schools. And the thing is that somebody might disagree with that, but that's fine. They can have another different school or a cottage school or homeschool where they can have a different alternative. But parents are really concerned about these things and want to have a say. And one cannot make a formula that everybody's going to be happy with. So if I could have the next slide. So the solution is to empower parents through the governing bodies, through homeschooling choice, through respecting parental authority, and to also enable renting of facilities. Not every private school that wants to start up is going to be able to have its own school field. So if they can rent school fields from another school or a swimming pool and have an agreement that is reasonably secure, that is really helpful. Also, the opportunity for startup churches to share school things and input into the school finances. I think that it's going to be much better if there's a 3-year rental period that is allowed rather than a 1-year rental period, because that gives more security to these groups. Then if I could have the next slide. Now, in terms of these options, I've got a photograph here of a parent who was jailed for homeschooling. He was the first parent who took a stand, and he said to the apartheid government, no, he didn't want to send his children to the public school. And so they put him in separate jail from his wife and sent the children off to an orphanage. Now, we never want this to happen again. That is Andre and Bokkie Mankies, and they did that for their Christian conviction. So this penalty clause would like to have that distinct, that jail time must be for people who violently intimidate learners to stop them from going to school. It mustn't be for parents who decide to choose homeschooling instead. And a lot of parents are so upset with what is being pushed through the education department, particularly on the sex education issue and on gender issues, that they are not trustful to want to register at the moment. And I think that that is a trust that needs to be rebuilt, but that trust has been very badly damaged. Also, some parents complain of a kind of an assertive bullying approach that they're not happy with. So now, if we go on to the next slide, this proposal would increase the costs of homeschools. They would have to hire consultants, where they're already losing one parent's salary by homeschooling. They're going to have to do a whole lot more paperwork, and it's going to be more costs for the department to process all of these proposals. And they're also going to have less curriculum choice. Now, what I've discovered in researching homeschooling is that a lot of parents, when they start homeschooling, they kind of follow the state curriculum, but then as they go on, they deviate from the curriculum. They find better ways that are more suitable for their child, and they kind of work more towards a project approach rather than what would be mimicked in a classroom environment. But at the end of the day, it has a similar result to attending school, mostly better. And we've got children that are graduating now into university who've been homeschooled. They're quite fine. They're coping quite okay. And really, they're choosing homeschooling a lot of the time because they want a specific curriculum that they want to follow, or approach that is different, and often that is a Christian-based curriculum that they are wanting, but other people choosing other curriculums. Next slide, please. Now, the next issue is the question of language medium. Now, if we remember the anger of the 1976 riots, now, and against the state attempting to impose a language policy, one size fits all on everybody. And so I think we can avoid that by adopting this policy. Next slide. Then there's the tax issues that there are many, next slide, additional costs with this proposal. Llewellyn, next slide, please. Then the question of the security of this data that governing bodies are going to have to put in. I do not believe the education department can keep all of this data secure. It's going to be vulnerable to hackers. The education department could have a poppy class action suit if it is breached by hackers, unless the education department wants to upgrade all the financial infrastructure to protect this data, which is going to cost a whole lot of money. So otherwise, this is going to deter parents from wanting to be on the governing body. And there are also, we would also like, in terms of leases, to shift this from a proposed 1-year maximum lease to a 3-year maximum lease or 6 months notice, which would be much better for the parties involved. Then this Bela bill allows the minister to make more regulations that can further erode. Next slide, please, Llewellyn. It's next several slides. Can erode the authority of parents. And I think we reached a high point under Minister Bengu, and since then it's been going down. Each year there's been more powers taken away from parents, and we would say this is not helpful. The state should concentrate on helping those schools that are struggling and leave the parents that are doing a good job alone to run those schools that are doing well. So this could give the minister a blank check to further erode parents' rights without coming back to Parliament in both home education and in schools. So if I've given the example of Milnerton Beach, if you go and visit there, in Bloberg Beach, every year it's just being eroded back by the sea because of some bad engineering decisions. And we don't want this erosion to carry on with parental rights. We also ask for the financial reports for independent schools would be much more reasonable if you made it quarterly rather than annual. But in all of this detail, I think the principle must be remembered that the parents are the ones who care most about their child, and they need to be empowered and strengthened. And if there are governing bodies that are weak, we want to help them to become stronger, not to take powers away from them. So I thank you for this opportunity, and happy to handle questions. But I would really like to ask you as parliamentarians to think about the value you place on your child, and to empower every other parent in this country to have that power to make decisions for their child.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosenthal. That is the view of the Christian View Network. Those are the clauses they feel that strongly they don't agree with the amendments that the department is proposing to do. Anything from the members' point of clarities? Also.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think previous experienced teachers that every member would like to engage. It's a little bit like, I don't know what you call it in English, but a bitty. It takes very long for the first one to stand up and make a prayer, but once somebody started, it doesn't get in time. Well, what I would like to ask from you is, we have this dilemma of having a secular state, in which according to the Constitution, it's actually religious neutral. And then we have very religious people. And we have to navigate within that. I think it's for many of us a personal but also a public concern. How do we navigate within the secular state as being, in my case, a Christian, in another person's case, another religion? And it has a very strong bearing on education. I think it's one of the most important questions within public schools, which use public money. But it could even become relevant to independent schools, where somebody might argue that because of the secular nature of the state not even independent education should be allowed to promote a certain religion in school. I think that would be an extreme application of the secular nature of the Constitution. But as we have seen, the real Constitution shifts all the time, while the written Constitution remains unchanged for decades. The real actual Constitution of the country is changing all the time, and it is changing away from religion in schools, where that was fairly standard in the early phase of the present dispensation. Now, the reason why I'm saying all this is I want to ask from the Christian network, how do you envisage, I would like to say us, because I share that Christian value system with you, but let's term it in more general terms. How should religious groups navigate within the secular state? And should one look maybe at even pushing back in order to shift the Constitution in the other way than which has been becoming the norm in the previous years? Thank you, Honorable Chair.
Honorable Bela.
Thank you, Chairperson, and also thank you, the presenter. Well, I listened to you very carefully, and Honorable Bosch have covered me on the issue of the secular state. But then what I would like to know from you, in what way is the Bela bill taking the right of parents to decide on their children? Because I want to hear that. And secondly, just on the issue of language, are you comfortable with the current situation where language is used to exclude certain groupings within the education system? I just want to hear your view on that. Thank you, Chair.
Honorable Adwins.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. Let me also appreciate the presentation that is it was done. I think I was covered on the issue of the language policy and the clause that seeks to amend it. But maybe before I ask this two specific questions. Firstly, I would want to check if the department is with us, maybe to clarify some of the information that has been presented here, because the first one is that it was not clear which clauses you were referring to. Maybe going forward, members or presenters will also talk into the specific clauses to say clause 1, 2, 3, 4, because there are about 56 clauses that they are seeking to amend the South African Schools Act. So maybe if you can be specific on those clauses. But my second issue is with regard to maybe if I can get the clarity on the registration of homeschooling, you know, if maybe also the department can elaborate more, if what will be the penalties if you are not registered and the likes. That will be my second point. The third point, it was on the SGB powers that are being taken or assumed to be taken if the bill passes, vis-a-vis the empowerment of SGBs. If also maybe we can get clarity on that. Thank you very much.
Noted. Noted.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. And I listened quite clearly. So obviously, as a member of the committee dealing with the bill, and knowing what clauses are in the bill, I'll probably ask you very specifics, because some of the things that you've presented here obviously fit in some specific clauses of the bill, so that I can get some clarity as to, based on your presentation, what do you then orally submit to the committee, so that we are all clear. The first one is around the statement made that there's been more powers given to the minister versus those powers being taken away from parents who, as stated, you believe is best suited to decide on the future and education of their children. Now, some of the powers that you've mentioned around the powers taken away from school governing bodies, which are mostly parents that are represented there, and those powers being education and being admissions and language, determining the admissions and language policy. Are you then submitting orally to the committee that, as the Christian View Network, that you believe that the school governing body powers to determine admissions and language should remain with the parents? Or is there an alternative to that? And if that is the case, if you can maybe just elaborate more as to why you believe that. Secondly, there's been a question asked by Honorable Boshoff, which, from my deduction of what you've presented, most of the points that was made was around choice, that parents must be able to choose, despite what their beliefs are. Would that assertion that I make be correct? Despite whether I'm a Christian or not, yes. What you're fighting for is, or what you're presenting to us is that parents must have the ability to choose where they would like to send their children, and not necessarily be told what schooling they will get. And linked with that, there was a point made around homeschooling education, and your proposal here, from my deduction, is that you don't believe that there should be consultants that parents should be forced to kind of get to be able to determine whether the conditions in which they teach their children are correct. What alternative do you then put in place as a proposal to the amendment of the bill itself? If you, as part of your proposal, believe that that will increase costs, because I do think that there needs to be some form of accountability in some way, even though a child is homeschooled, so that we ensure that that child's right to access education is not infringed, but it is monitored. Then the second last one, Chair, there's a point that is critical that you made. Focus on broken schools and not break what works. And in many instances, parents choose schools that are far away from their community. They probably best serve better quality education, or they choose to take their children to those schools because of whatever their reasons are, but they choose to take their children to those schools. And along the way, they skip quite a lot of schools. My parents were one of those people that did that, because the schools that were close by were actually not good enough for what they believed I should get. Now, in saying that, part of your proposal is to say that, fix what's broken. Don't disempower school governing bodies, parents that already are working and doing and making this work, but rather focus your energies in making sure that those schools that are actually being driven past by parents to go look for better schools are actually functional. Now, the proposal that has been put here is that for us to be able to curb that, let's take away some specific powers around admissions and language, and therefore we'll solve the problem. Do you believe that that will solve the problem by taking away those school governing body powers that are from schools that are already functional, away from them, to balance the scale with the schools that are actually not functional in terms of their school governing body powers? Or what alternative proposal would you put in place for us to amend the law to ensure that we uplift those school governing bodies that are actually dysfunctional in schools that parents drive past because they believe they're not adequate, to ensure that we increase the quality, access, and language offering there. The last one, Chair, is also specifically around language. Do you believe that mother tongue education improves the depth of knowledge of a child and the quality of education that they receive? As an example, if I study my maths in Xhosa, as I am, and somebody else may choose to study it in Afrikaans, or someone in Chivenda, language of, whatever mother tongue they are at home, do you believe that there's better depth and better quality of education that they can receive? And should the bill not actually be focusing on building mother tongue education rather than saying, well, let's get rid of these single medium schools and balance the equal playing field so everyone can access it, rather than building the capacity of those schools that may not necessarily offer the mother tongue education in other provinces that people inherently speak their own mother tongue. Example, the Eastern Cape, Xhosa, or Limpopo, you've got Bedi, Benda, in different other languages. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your presentation. I want to bring up what you ended your presentation with, which is the rights of parents. And you stated the rights of parents should be respected. If I should summarize on what you've said, should be respected and recognized, and the powers of the minister should not limit the rights of parents or undermine that. If you would please expand in your view, as you look at the current legislation and your experience in the education sector, to what extent has the state and the minister then therefore, especially with this legislation that is before us now, has limited the rights of parents? And I should add, the rights of parents universally is recognized. And certainly I would say in our constitution, the rights of parents were accepted and therefore it was not stated. Do you foresee that such an amendment should be made in the constitution, given your experience and the risks of the Bela bill as you have today brought before the committee? Thank you, Chair.
Is it my turn, Chair? Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chairperson, and let us appreciate and welcome the presentation from the Christian View Network. A lot was said. Maybe a lot need to be clarified. You see, I'm being intimidated by the very people who must be protecting me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. You see, I was still saying, Chairperson, a lot was said. Maybe a lot may need to be clarified. In the first place, I think the first challenge which you are likely to face here is that the Christian View Network might be projecting the fear of the unknown. You see, Chairperson, what is happening, especially in the South African education system, I have not seen a situation whereby the South African education system is patronizing whatever religion at the expenses of the other. I have not seen that, but maybe I will have to be clarified. And secondly, the issue of, as Honorable Sukers is indicating the violation of the rights of parents. I'm still waiting to be convinced if indeed there is any such insinuation in the bill which may or which appear to be threatening the rights of the parents in the education of their children. There was a clip which was shown during his presentation when he was talking about the homeschooling, where it reflected, I think Honorable Aduans touched it in passing, that the parents taking a risk for a jail term, and so that the homeschooling for his children or their children must be realized. Chair, the greatest challenge that we might be facing, and maybe in some parents, or I mean some other organizations or stakeholders which will still be coming forward here, is we have to consider and take into cognizance that the South African education system exposes education in such a way that it becomes a public asset. And where education becomes a public asset, of course, we may at the end of the day, the system may at the end of the day, trample on the rights of some other private people who want to privatize education in one way or the other, where you will find out that a public notion infringes into the rights of somebody who would love to privatize things and see education run according to his or her own taste. The challenge we are facing, of course, is the real pragmatic challenge. One of the pragmatic challenges we are facing in South Africa is people may love to have education as a private commodity, but going forward, at the same time, they would love the same state to fund the infrastructure, the same state to fund remuneration of educators. Then how, at the end of the day, do we reconcile that? There is no way in which, when we come to the concept of the role of SGBs, you see, for any organization or institution to stand, the center must hold. And in many different schools, with many different SGBs, where are we going to point and say it's our center? The center at the end of the day will have to rely either with the HOD of that department or the the MEC, at the end, the Director General and the Minister. They should be the center that must be able to hold in order to direct the education of our country, hence the education to our own children. So I was just trying to make this basis so that going forward, we should have a common footing with common understanding. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I don't see a hand from the virtual platform. I take it that the members that are there are fine. And on that note, no, it's fine, Advocate Misa. I'll note you. I think there are some clarifications that you will have to do from the side of the department too. I was just checking for members, so it's fine. If we do not have members, let me allow you then, Advocate Misa.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to the Honourable Chair, the Honourable members, to the stakeholders of civil society that are present, and colleagues on the platform. I must say that the presentation by the Christian View Network is appreciated. Chairperson, just a point of clarification on a few issues that were raised. So, for example, with regards to homeschooling, which seems to be, a bone of contention in terms of how the department wishes to ensure that its responsibility for ensuring that learners are schooled, is being perceived, needs to be clarified. In a meeting that was held with Minister in 2020, it was the 27th or 28th of January, we did have engagements with representatives from, who represents the homeschooling sector. And there, Minister explained that she encompasses, in fact, she embraces homeschooling because it's a very important part of the education system. And at that particular meeting, we agreed that a once-off registration for homeschooling, when the child begins homeschooling, will be required. And thereafter, when the child moves from phase to phase, it will be just a notification process. And that's what the bill reads. Now, with regards to the fears about conviction, the conviction clause that we have in the bill, that is, subsection 6. And if you look at the Act itself, Section 6 of the Act has always had this penalty clause. All that has been done currently is to increase the period of imprisonment, which was 6 months. It is in the Act as it stands, to 12 months, and to include or to insert that or to both such fine and such imprisonment. Now, one of the reasons for increasing it to 12 months was because of the high dropout rate in schools. It is not targeted at homeschooling at all. And it's not targeted at any individual group at all. It is because of this, we thought that maybe if we increase the penalty clause, that parents will take the issue of ensuring that their child attends schools more seriously in order to prevent the high dropout rates. So that was the purpose of that particular clause when it came to conviction. Also, Chairperson, the issue of the admission policy and the language policy, yes, indeed, we have given the powers to the HOD to approve an admission policy or a language policy where there have been amendments made to it. And the reason for this is to align it with, case law, which indicated that the control over the implementation of admissions is, it may rest with the head of department. It's not the exclusive, within the exclusive function of the SGB. And hence we gave that position to the head of department. And also many schools were using the admission policy and the language policy to exclude learners. And hence, we've made these changes. And we've also have a deeming clause that where the head of department, where you submit your admission policy or your language policy to the head of department for approval, that if the head of department does not approve it within the time period that has been specified in the bill, within the 60-day period, then it is deemed to be approved. So if there are fears that, there would be an admission policy that would be lying that is not approved, this can be allied by the deeming provision within the Bela bill. With regards to the financial interests of the SGB and declaring the financial interest, the reason for having included that clause, and it came up, it was a provision that was sponsored by, after consultation with CEM, whereby it was felt that we needed to ensure that we stamp out corruption within the education sector, particularly when it comes to giving, for example, if we need to fence a particular school and I'm on the SGB, I then quickly open up a company in my son's name and give the job to my son, in order to prevent and to avoid those kind of situations, to encourage and foster good governance, even amongst SGB members, that we then, after consultation, put in that particular clause. Did I leave out anything else? Yes, Chairperson, and the issue of the rights of parents when it comes to homeschooling, Minister embraces it, and she has even expressed that at the meeting that we had with representatives of the home education sector. And the issue of the competent assessors, that is, a mechanism to ensure that the schooling that is being provided at home by parents for their learners, that it is of a standard that is equivalent to that is presented at a public school. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Advocate Misa. I think those are the clarities that members were seeking from the department. Can I allow you to say something?
Okay, thank you. Okay, firstly, I'd like to address these in the order that they were asked. So if I start off with Mr. Boshoff, this question of that South Africa is a secular state, I was challenged that as a myth and very misleading on a number of points, and especially with regard to education. Firstly, the Constitution starts with a preamble that acknowledges God. And secondly, we have specifically a clause on education in the Constitution that allows for religious observances. And I know that that was put in very specifically by the Constitutional Assembly to avoid an American type situation of the 1960 wrong interpretation of the American Constitution that then excluded religious observances in the schools. Now, that clause in the Constitution needs to be read in parallel with the Schools Act, which was written also at the same time in 1996, and which parallels it in almost identical wording, except for the changing of a few words, which further clarifies that the authority that is intended by the Constitution to make that decision on religious observances is the school governing body. Okay, so that is the first issue. The second issue is that at the time, there was huge protest from parents about the risk that South Africa would have a secular state, and we had a promise specifically from Cyril Ramaphosa that South Africa would not be a secular state. That was reported in the newspapers. So that is on the interpretation. I think you're not going to find any of those people who were around at the time interpreting that way. Further, one has Minister Bengu's policy that he instituted at the time, the first education minister that was after the Constitution, explicitly that his religion policy allowed for different schools to have complete freedom to choose a single medium religious instruction if they wanted to, paralleling the policies of Nigeria and of Israel, for example. So this is a myth, and there are many ways of accommodating difference within the parent body. That includes, firstly, different schools having different policies and people choosing that. Then within a school, you can have streams where people go off and have different religious observances if they want to. And then you can also have conscientious objection, which is a third level to accommodate parents. So that is something which is simply not a correct interpretation. Now, we've had this progressive erosion since Minister Bengu's very good policy of religious freedom and parental rights. That was, and Minister Kada Asmal took a huge chunk out of that freedom with his 2003 religion and education policy. He had a meeting in this building at which I was present, in which he then presented his policy, claiming he had now listened to parents and religious bodies that were protesting against that. I put 10 points that we had not agreed with forward to the group. I was thrown out by security. Okay, there is no agreement. We did not agree to that policy. We continue to protest against that. Then further, there was the court judgment in 2017, which 6 schools were challenged on their religious observances. We would argue that was a wrong court judgment. It should have been appealed. It will be appealed in future. That is not a correct interpretation of the Constitution. Anybody who wants to discuss this is welcome to speak to me, or we can have a debate on radio or whatever. But to me, this is a power grab by the state from parents and away from religious freedom, and we want that power back again. Then the question that the parents must, through those structures, decide on how that public money is distributed in various ways according to their preferences. I can talk more than that. I don't want to run out of time. Then, in terms of the question of Mr. Zwele, in what way is the Bela bill taking away that right to decide? These are small incremental erosions every time decision-making power is taken away from parents and given to central government. And we want maximum devolved to the lowest possible level for decisions to be made for those children in homeschooling, in private schools, in that particular school, or in a stream within that school. Then the question of language being used to exclude people. We've got 1 in 20 schools in this country which are using Afrikaans language. And personally, I don't want to speak the Afrikaans language, but I have another friend who has chosen, he's English, but he's chosen to send his children to an Afrikaans school because he likes the religious ethos of that school. And any parent has that choice if they want to go. That my ancestors were German speaking when they came to this country. They had to learn English, but that is for they could have carried on in German if they decided to be homeschooled, but this is the choice we want to give to parents. And look, things are imperfect in any society when we have to make common decisions, but we have to decide which problems the state needs to intervene on. And I'd say where there are really serious problems and parents are wanting help, then the state gets involved on those things. Then the question of which clauses, I'll be happy to read through each clause, but probably I'm going to be given a timeout. So I will make another submission. I've given it in my detailed 6-page submission, all the clause numbers, but I will make a summary of the clause numbers to refer to all of these things, and I will send that to the committee secretary. The question of the penalties from Nomaselo, but with homeschooling, I accept that it was not the intention of the department to do this, but we do not want to have a power which can be misused by a political leader in future. And having followed the political process for 30 years, I have seen many times unintended consequences. I've warned about them and they've happened. So I don't put it past this happening. And so we'd like to separate the question of criminal obstruction from parental choice, and so that no parent is ever at risk of going to jail on these things. Then the question of what should remain with parents, I think I've elaborated in a whole lot more detail, and I'd be happy to, if the chairperson would give me more time, but essentially we want to maximize the powers given to parents through those 3 tiers that I just gave, of the school governing body making a policy, of streams within a school, of conscientious objection if the parents not happy with something, and that also includes the right to opt out of things like sex education or religious things they're not happy with. The question of homeschoolings, how does one verify these things that was asked? I would propose that each parent should keep a portfolio of what they've been teaching their children that is available for inspection if necessary. That would not require consultants' costs, and particularly the accountability, I would say, would be if some relative then or friend claims, okay, these children are not being educated, well, the parent can then produce that portfolio of what they've been teaching them. Then the question of focusing on broken schools, yes, exactly. I think that if there are problems with, some child doesn't get into the school that they want to because of the language policy, that's a pretty minor problem. We've got crisis problems in some schools of complete dysfunction, of gangs dominating the school. Those are the schools that the education department needs to be focusing on, and to get functional. Most of these schools don't have a functional SGB, and those are the schools that need help from the government, not the schools that have a functional SGB having their powers taken away from them. The question on mother tongue education, I would argue that that is a debatable question, which is for those parents to answer and not for me to answer. I know I have a friend who started a school in Zululand, English medium, and a lot of parents were very happy to send their children to that. other people would prefer Zulu medium, or other people want Afrikaans medium. That's not really for us to decide. That is for those parents to make that decision, and according to the choices that are available to them. And I'd also want that widened choice to include cottage schools. Then the question of not limiting the powers of the parent, I think one only wants to limit the powers of the parents with respect to other parents, where there is a need to force for a common policy. But within the framework that I proposed, you'd have a maximum diversity and empowerment of parents. So the question of amending the Constitution, personally, I don't think the Constitutional needs amendment on this, on the education clause. It already allows for this question of religious ethos. It's just that it's been wrongly interpreted by the court. I did have a discussion with one of the lawyers who was involved in drafting the Constitution, and he expressed to me that he felt that his one regret was a failure to include a clause on the protection of the family, and quite possibly that is an amendment that we need to include, paralleling the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. That is also in the Western Cape Constitution. So possibly, yes, that would be a good idea, but I don't think the problem is the Constitution. I think the problem is the way the Constitution is being misinterpreted by, I think, secularists and woke people who believe that their interpretation is the only one that is allowed in the schools. I don't think it's correct. Yeah, so with respect to these, the rebuttal of the department, I appreciate they didn't have that intended effect, but I'm been involved in making submissions on many laws which had unintended effects, and we don't want the possibility of those effects. And we've got to look at the question of what is the greater evil that we are trying to avoid, as opposed to these other problems. And the greater evil is avoided by giving maximum power to parents to make decisions. There will be some flaws, but that is the best way forward. Then in terms of this avoidance of corruption, yes, I agree we need to avoid corruption, but this is complete overkill. Corruption is avoided by strong SGBs and accountability to the parents that would get the best people off not wanting to be part of the SGB. And one can deal with this clause. Section 36 of the Constitution requires looking at the less restrictive means to achieve what an end. And the less restrictive means that I would propose is that any business that an SGB person has with the school should be publicly disclosed, and preferably they shouldn't be allowed to do any business at all. They don't need to declare every single thing that they are doing. They're sacrificing a whole lot of their time and their skills to help the school, and good people are going to be discouraged from that. You don't need to get them to violate their financial privacy, much less that of their children or their wife or somebody who might not want to do that. So my appeal is that the solution is empowering parents and letting them sort out the problems rather than to try and sort out all the problems for them. And where government puts its effort is not into micro-regulating homeschooling and functional SGBs, but into dealing with these enormous problems where you have gangs and drug pushers that are dominating certain schools. We need to strengthen those so that they have parent-led situations. And also in terms of improvement, there's two proposals. One is that I've spoken to the school governing body associations, and they have offered to help other schools that don't have good governing bodies to become functional. That proposal hasn't been accepted. The second proposal is that one allows charter schools, which are partnerships with independent organizations, which can be a business or an NGO, that then says, we will work in partnership with the school, they will have our ethos, and we will put money and time and effort into that. So then that becomes semi-private. We've never had a situation where everybody is happy with the Department of Education's policy, but this framework for diversity is the best solution that we can come up with.